What's up? Hope everybody's all right today on a nice Saturday afternoon. What is this? Saturday? Saturday afternoon. Today we're covering Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper. Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. And this is a sponsored stream by our buddy Jack out there, who dropped some fat Kong bucks, some fat Dugan coin to sponsor the stream. So yes, thank you to Jack out there. Really appreciate you, homeboy, as always. Thank you for sponsoring the stream on Mark Twain. And we're about to dive in. This story is not quite like you may remember. If you remember, you may not have read it. I read it in, I don't know, second grade or something. I think I was in second grade when I read it, and we watched the film, the Diznee film, at school, and I loved the film, especially back then, because it was about the age of the characters in the story, in the novel. But it is definitely not like you remember it at all. It's completely different. It's really dark. I mean, it ends. It's actually it's interesting that it's sort of a Shakespearean comedy in a way, because the protagonists go through, of course they're doubles, and we're going to go into that, but they go through a series of adventures on their own, independently of each other, and after they first meet up, and we get great. I mean, there's great characterization in this book. We get their whole story, their whole lives, essentially, but they go through a lot, especially, of course, the actual prince, who becomes the king, who becomes King Edward VI over the course of the book. It was fairly early on in the book, although he knows it, but there's not really anything he can do about it. And the book actually involves decapitation, burning at the stake. Let me turn this fan down because it's pretty loud. Hold on one second. Yeah, okay, that should be a little better. Okay, so it involves decapitation, burning at the stake, imprisonment, child abuse, extreme trauma. What's up, Rasky? Shouts out to you. It involves death and gore and torture, and there's actually a scene. I totally forgot about this scene. There's actually a scene with a serial killing hermit, child killer, who's about to do a ritual murder in his hovel before he's interrupted. So it's pretty dark, and that is obviously part of the theme of the novel is the I guess the fact that the characters undergo a major transformation, are able to see sides of life that they weren't able to see before, right? Nowadays, I don't know what you call it. You call that empathy, I guess, but we'll try to shy away from that term. I think it's a misnomer in the first place. But this is essentially a story of walking a mile in my shoes, right? No, before you abuse, criticize, right? Shouts out to Big E out there. But as we say with literature, as I kind of always do when I'm analyzing, works of literature are not like mysteries to be solved or puzzles or fables. It's not a fable. It is a children's story, but it's not, and it's pretty dark. It was written purposefully as a children's story. Obviously, it was dedicated to Twain's two daughters, which we'll get into. But the themes in it are certainly life lessons, and there's a worldview. But it ends with redemption and restoration, which is brilliant. It ends in a great way. It's totally positive. So by those standards, it's a kind of a Shakespearean Renaissance tragedy, and that's fitting because this is the novel takes place in the mid 1500s, the mid 16th century, around the time of the death of Henry VIII and the succession of his and the ascension to the throne of Edward VI. It also involves some well-known historical characters, Lady Jane Grey, especially Elizabeth is in this, and Bloody Mary makes an appearance towards the end of the novel. So before I get started and sort of dive into, I mean, I basically gave you what I think of the novel in terms of my thesis for it, but I'll get into that a little bit more specifically in a minute. Shouts out to everybody out there. Please think about supporting me, you guys. You people out there, human citizens. It's late August. We're getting into fall. And I know everybody's working hard out there. I sure can use your support. So please make sure you look at the links that my homies drop in the chat and also the video description, the chat description. We've been covering a lot late, a lot. I mean, you know, it's always fun, of course. But we've been covering some pretty heavy material recently, and I thought the last stream we did was pretty fun. Coming up, we are going to cover. I think I'm debating about what is the next stream because we don't have any more sponsor streams. Of course, we just did our sponsor stream from Countess on Catcher in the Rye, and I'm debating on what to cover next. I'm not debating. I'm thinking. I'm considering what to cover coming up. But I think probably I've got two choices here. Maybe you guys can help me out. Drop a something in the comments after the video's over, or drop it in the chat what you think I should cover next. I've been talking about Joe Esterhazy and the Hollywood Scumbag stream, and today I got my copy of High Concept, Don Simpson and the Hollywood Culture of Excess, first edition copy. Look at Don on the back. Can you see him? He's standing in front of the Bad Boys logo. So I think we're either gonna cover that, and we're gonna discuss some movies, of course, in connection with that, and the great interview between Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer. I hope people are excited about. I mean, maybe you're not. I hope people are gonna dig that because it's about movies, but we're obviously using the text as a basis for that, and I think that'll be a cool thing to cover because I'm really interested. I'm sure everybody here loves movies. Or at least discussing movies. And shouts out to JD at Jay's Analysis, who is the esoteric Hollywood movie analyzer, right? So I think that we're gonna discuss a couple of Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer films, especially Crimson Tide, the original Top Gun. It's obviously been discussed already, but the making of it and what it says in the text about how they came up with this movie. And of course, of course, Basic Instinct by Joe Esterhazy, because I'll be reading his 700-page book, Hollywood Animal. So I think that'll be pretty interesting. There'll be some fun, excessive information and some stories that come out of that. And then, of course, the other thing that I'm gonna cover, I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm gonna cover this either next or after that, is gonna be Chris Kyle's American Sniper. Hello, this is Governor Jesse Ventura. I'm calling in from Minnesota to discuss how you're doing an analyzation of this Chris Kyle book. I want to talk about Chris Kyle. This is Governor Ventura. Listen, we're going to be covering American Sniper, the book. This is my copy that I got at the time of publication. I read it. Let's see. I forget when I read it. But anyway, that and the Clint Eastwood film. And of course, you guys, I'm sure, have seen the RT interview. I think it was with Sean Stone and his analysis of the film and the propaganda elements in the film. So we'll be talking about the high propaganda in the American Sniper film, and then we'll be comparing that to the book, and we'll be discussing some of the historical or propagandistic elements in the Chris Kyle story, especially related to Zarqawi and some of the not moral. Well, we'll discuss that when we get to it, right? So let me know in the video afterwards if you. I was a governor, but I'm still. Have I ever told you about when I rode with the Mongols? They made me a full-fledged member of their motorcycle club. It's a club. Make sure you call it a club. That's what we're discussing here. So, also some things coming up that I'm considering. I don't know. This one might be for the ladies. I get a lot of requests to cover Jane Austen. So I think I'll be doing Emma, or I might be doing like a Jane Austen, Bronte sisters, Wuthering Heights, etc. stream on the Northern England and the Moors and the 19th century in England. I think that would be interesting to do. Also, I'm going to do probably one on Thomas Hardy's Test of the D'Urbervilles, and some other books that just come to mind when we're doing our analysis tonight. The Mongols. Yes, shouts out to Jeff. The 100 Years' War is a good book on the 100 Years' War. It doesn't exactly tie into what we're discussing tonight, but it's kind of a good prerequisite. This book on the 100 Years' War by Desmond Seward. And also, I've got a book on Edward V up there, the Princes and the Towers. We've covered that before when we discussed Richard III, right, and the Princes and the Towers. So tonight we'll be discussing some of Tudor 16th and 17th century English history and who Edward VI was. Yeah, we might be talking also about Jane Eyre, and how Jane Eyre is well, Jane Eyre is the original novel, but the sort of fantastical prequel to Jane Eyre is the book Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. If you haven't seen that, if you haven't seen the film, it's a novel, of course, by Jean Rhys, but it's a film also with, I think Sophie Marceau is in it. It's a sexy movie. So anyway, we may be covering that. And let's see. So, yes, and Andrea Kane asked for Poe during October. So we've done a Poe stream, but we can go back into Poe. Especially, we'll be doing some stuff for Spooktober, trademark JD. But we'll be doing a bunch of Spooktober stuff coming up because we didn't have a channel last Spooktober, so we'll be doing that this October. Okay, so let's dive into The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. So first of all, he wrote the book. Let's see. I'm not going to really talk about Mark Twain's life, not only because we usually just talk about the text, and it's sort of in a way, you know, it's interesting as background, but in a way it's irrelevant because of the speaker on the page and the distance or the difference between the speaker and the writer. And also, I'm not that into Twain himself. I've never been into Twain that much. I've read, I don't know, maybe all of his books, but I'm not really that into Twain. But I do like The Prince and the Pauper because of, you know, my own, what I just discussed in the beginning of this. But I will say just that Mark Twain, of course, Samuel Clemens, everybody knows that. You're right. Mark the Twain, you know, Riverboats, St. Louis, all that stuff. And I'm not saying that to be sarcastic. I'm just saying, I'm sure everybody knows that. But he was born in 1835. And between 1876 and 1884, he published Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and The Prince and the Pauper. Pretty good spate of writing there. Of course, he published this book, or he first composed the book as a reaction to his second continental tour of Europe. Remember that especially in the 19th century and prior to that, wealthy Americans and especially Europe, the English would take what they would call a continental tour or the grand tour of Europe. Remember, we discussed this in the Aleister Crowley stream. He did this. Mark Twain, of course, was famous. He did this, and he came away with some biting criticisms of the social structure in Europe and especially England. And it's funny to listen to his comments or read his comments now about it, because Mark Twain, of course, was a proponent of the fact that he thought that democracy would solve all of the social structure problems, especially the chasm that exists between the lower classes and the upper class. And of course, that's exactly what democracy has created, or at least exacerbated, right? And it's amazing because the things that occur in the book are sort of no different in a way than they are now. In fact, now they're much more focused and apparent. The book he wrote it for his daughters, but it is a satire. It is a work of adult satire. And the epigraph to the book, of course, that I put in the description of the video, comes from The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare. And it says, the quality of mercy is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. And of course, that sets the theme for the book we're about to read. It also starts off with a letter from the 1600s about Edward VI. I was always fascinated with Edward VI. I always thought he was really cool because, he's the son of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, of course, wanted sons, and we know about that whole business, and his 6 wives. But that's right, Maddie. Yes, always comes back to Shakespeare around here, of course. And in fact, a lot of the narrative in The Prince and the Pauper takes its cue from Henry V. We've covered actually the scene in Henry V where he sort of becomes, he goes through his sort of rite of passage and then becomes king. He goes from being Hal and Harry to Henry V. And there is a scene in the book that sort of emulates that. And it obviously takes its cue from that. One thing I find interesting in this that we were talking about just in terms of form and content, we were talking in the Salinger stream about how the diction, the specific vernacular in which the protagonist speaks, Holden Caulfield, throughout that. And of course, we talked about James Joyce and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and how they speak in the voice of the age, right, in which the character is. And so one thing that's interesting about this is the opposite, right? This is a pretty high diction, and that's also because it is meant to be a kind of, not a cautionary tale, but it's almost a fairy tale in a way, a pre-20th century fairy tale for children, but it's written in a sort of a high diction, and it's written actually in a kind of an archaic vernacular that's supposed to semi-mirror the pre-Elizabethan kind of Henriade. It's modern English, but it is a sort of a Shakespeare, and that's the way that the characters speak, right? There are a lot of archaic thous and thous. We can't call it Jacobean or King James because it's way before that. And it's also, it is written in short chapters, which is obviously aimed at children and at your consumption of the novel. But one thing that I would say that my thesis statement for my analysis for this book is that what Twain does here is he writes a kind of proto-neo-Arthurian quest tale, because I couldn't help but think that the way the narrative is structured and the way that the characters go through adventures exactly emulates Chrétien de Troyes and Malory with the Arthurian tales, because the characters go through a number of stages, and they're not. It's not like a Gnostic quest. It's not quite a Jungian archetypal journey, but in a way it's the hero's journey. But it is specifically Arthurian, and that makes sense because Twain, of course, was educated and fascinated by the English and by English literature and history, and I think that probably influenced him. This is speculation. This latter part influenced him, especially on his return from his European journeys, from his grand tour the second time, and the characters go through a kind of a process of discovery. Certainly a rite of passage for the king himself, who becomes the Tom character. It's interesting that the book does have, one of the purposes of the book is like kind of the unification of opposites. You have one character, they flip, they invert. So the pauper becomes the prince becomes the pauper. Yes, we know that. But they don't exactly meet in the middle. They transcend their state and their strata, and at the end, the comedy, which is, of course, not comedy in terms of laughs, but comedy in terms of the happy ending, is really a kind of Much Ado About Nothing Shakespearean comedy of errors, which ends up in the restoration of the characters and the uplifting of the pauper character, Tom, into a state that is going to carry him through the rest of his life. There are a number of low characters in this who are raised up. And then, of course, loyalty is one of the motifs of the novel, because loyalty is consistently rewarded. So basically it starts off with the fact that there's a character, Tom Canty. He's kind of a Tom of Bedlam character, which is a sort of an English folk archetypal character that we discussed in King Lear. Remember, we did the King Lear play, um, Shakespeare's the third Shakespearean tragedy of the four that we've covered, and we talked about how the character Edgar takes on this identity. He goes mad, takes on this identity, or at least seems to go mad. Takes on this character of Tom of Bedlam, where he is a low character. He's a beggar. And that is what Tom is in this. He is he lives in the most wretched place in London, off Pudding Lane, of course. There's a lot in this that's Americanized English, right? Especially with the emphasis on place names and London Bridge. Americans have always had this fascination with London Bridge, right? They think of it as this like magical place from whence they come. But it doesn't hold the same, especially in the contemporary era. It doesn't it doesn't really translate to the English. This is really more of an American fascination. 420, man. So what happens is he's born, and it talks about how he has little sisters, basically, and he's off Offal Court, Offal, so it's kind of a garbage place. And it says on page 16, when he came home empty-handed at night, he knew his father would curse him and thrash him first. His dad is a real piece of, let's call him a piece of work. It's in the family audience right now, but we are in the early stages of the evening, so we're going to be kind to the affiliates here. And Tom he's educated, and he kind of is educated secretly. I get it. I get the joke there. You're talking about Hotler. It says he often read the priest's old books and got him to explain and enlarge upon them. His dreamings and readings worked certain changes in him by and by. His dream people were so fine that he grew to lament his shabby clothing and his dirt, and to wish to be clean and better clad. He went on to playing in the mud just the same and enjoying it too, but instead of splashing around in the Thames solely for the fun of it, he began to find an added value in it because of the washings and the cleansings it afforded. Kind of a baptismal image there. It says, once on page 17, one summer's day, he saw poor Anne Askew and 3 men burned at the stake in Smithfield, and heard an ex-bishop preach a sermon to them which did not interest him yet. Yes, Tom's life was varied and pleasant enough on the whole. Isn't that crazy? He's this little kid, and this is the reality of life at the time. So in a sense, Twain is just mirroring the reality, the reality. But nevertheless, it doesn't make it any less so. It doesn't make it any less traumatic, right, for this kid who's witnessing this stuff. Yeah, he witnesses a burning at the stake, and it's not just once, because the pauper, Tom, witnesses this, and then later what he goes through is mirrored by when the king, Edward, becomes the pauper. He will witness somebody burned at the stake. There are a few mentions of decapitated heads and decapitations, and of course that makes sense in light of the fact that Henry VIII personally appears in the novel. It says, by and by, Tom's reading and dreaming about princely life wrought such a strong effect upon him that he began to act the prince unconsciously. His speech and manners became curiously ceremonious and courtly to the vast admiration and amusement of his intimates. But Tom's influence among these young people began to grow now day by day. He was deep and wise. They began to discuss Tom Canty, to regard him as the most gifted and extraordinary creature. Full-grown people brought their perplexities to Tom for solution, and were often astonished at the wit and wisdom of his decisions. In fact, he was becoming a hero to all who knew him except his own family. These only saw nothing in him. So sad. There's a lot in this story that's really sad, and it's pretty heartbreaking, because he goes through. He of course becomes the king, but the king who becomes the pauper goes through so much, and that of course will resolve itself in the restoration at the end of the book. But it is pretty terrifying. But it also sets in place the hero's journey, right? Because he sees himself, he says he was a princeling himself, And one of the motifs in this is the blaze of light. On page 18, it says, "All night long, the glories of his royal estate shone upon him." He lives in absolute poverty. He's even when he's playing in the mud. I can't help but think of that scene in 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 Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You remember where the peasants are just stacking mud, right? And they're like, "No, we believe in an anarcho-capitalist system of, but they're just stacking mud all day, and that's pretty much what he does. But he's got this fantasy life where he's trying to transcend his own circumstances as a kid. He's using his imagination. And one of the motifs is the blaze of light. He moved among great lords and ladies in a blaze of light, breathing perfumes, drinking in delicious music, and answering the reverent obeisances of the glittering throng as it parted to make way for him, with here a smile and there a nod of his princely head. And when he awoke in the morning and looked upon the wretchedness about him, his dream had had its usual effect. It had intensified the sordidness of his surroundings 1,000-fold. Then came bitterness and heartbreak and tears. Sad, right? So, anyway, what he does is he decides to go on a little adventure. And what we don't learn much about his life until we learn about his life through the avatar, in a sense, of Edward when he becomes Tom, when he becomes the pauper. Because what we learn is that he is beaten by his family. They think he's nothing. They think he's just wretched. And he falls in with a motley crew, a literal motley crew of vagabonds and thieves who have ORGIES at night. He talks about that. And he's used as it's Dickensian, right? He's used as a kind of a artful dodger and a pickpocket. And at one point, one thing really disturbing was they actually rub a poultice on him, and they filled with lime, and they create these sores on his legs to try and make these postulating sores so that they will gain sympathy from outsiders and be able to get money. And of course, if this were now, this would be so they could feed John Canty his dad's drug addiction, and his his awful, just total degraded lifestyle. And but we don't really get that with Tom because, of course, Twain doesn't discuss this in the beginning of the book because he's living this fantasy life. But one day he goes on this adventure and he makes it all the way to Buckingham Palace, and he's standing outside the gates, and he's looking in through the gates, and he sees the prince, and he, of course, had never seen that. Now the prince and royalty, obviously, what it represents to him is the highest, form of life, the highest achievement in life. And he sees the prince, and they try and throw him away. They try and push him away. Right, piss off, you grotty little wanker, right? But he sees Edward VI, who's the Prince of Wales at the time, and he says, art thou being mean to yon wretched child? And he says, come hither, lad. And they're the same age. They talk to each other, and he sees that he's in rags, and he brings him into the palace, and they look at each other, and they look at each other in the mirror. That's why I included the images from, of course, the movie Enemy, which I just talked about in another stream too. But it's the doppelganger, right? Now, the doppelganger is not exactly this, because the doppelganger in literature really is it's not when a character meets somebody who looks exactly like them. It's when a character meets himself, right? Remember, we did this in William Wilson, the Poe short story. It's when there is an exact, not a clone, but it's you. You're meeting yourself. So this ties into the Tom character's sort of fantasy life, his imagination, and the fact that his life is shit. He's been fractured and all this stuff, and he sort of meets his double, or he meets himself, but in a mirror image opposite. And it's interesting that immediately the prince says, let's change clothes. They switch clothes, just like in Enemy, right? It's exactly the same with the Jake Gyllenhaal character in Enemy. And in a sense, remember, the character on the right here, the Jake Gyllenhaal character, is the movie star who is actually, he's not a movie star. He's a kind of a third-rate actor in local films. but he lives in this expensive high rise, and he is a gatekeeper, a literal gatekeeper, a keymaster for the elite and their eyes wide shut rituals. And then, of course, on the left we have he's not poor, but he's sort of poor in spirit. He's a low down history professor, kind of a schlubby character, and then they immediately switch clothes, right? They switch clothes and they take on each other's life, and that movie has not the redemption and the restoration that this has. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. The Prestige, Christopher Nolan's Prestige, which I love. That's a great movie. I would say that's obviously different because we have twins, right? Spoiler alert: we have twins, secret twins, who simply mirror each other purposefully as part of the illusion of the magic ritual. But in a sense, it is sort of the same kind of playoff between two mirror characters. And it says, let's see, just to describe the prince and what he looks like, it says, within was a comely boy, tanned and brown, with sturdy outdoor sports and exercise, whose clothing was all of lovely silks and satins shining with jewels. At his hip, a little jeweled sword and dagger, dainty buskins on his feet with red heels, and on his head a jaunty crimson cap with drooping plumes fastened with a great sparkling gem. I love the language there because it becomes euphonous, right? Twain becomes lyrical when he's discussing the kind of the kind of, you know, excessive pomp and circumstance of the prince and his surroundings. Everything is done for him, and that's one of the problems. What's interesting is that they switch places, and and of course the prince runs outside, and he immediately runs away, right? He's he's lived in a gilded cage, and he runs away because he thinks he's going to have freedom, and he's immediately sort of taken in, or not take. Nobody will accept him until he comes across this band of this motley crew, and then his own father, and that becomes a hellish world of trying to survive day to day. But both characters, and this is partly due to the youth element in it. Nobody's satisfied with where they're from, right? It doesn't. We've kind of discussed this before. When you're growing up, it's like it doesn't matter where you live. You can live in New York City where there's everything, and yet it's boring, right? Because it's like you want to escape. You want to go elsewhere, and that's part of the driving force of every young man becoming a man, that you want to go out and seek adventure and live life and find your own life. But what's interesting is that Tom, when he is mistaken for Edward VI, the Prince of Wales, he almost right away starts to become sad at his new circumstances. He thinks he's going to be happy, but instead he's gone from one kind of cage where he was free in the outside, but he had sort of an interior slavery, and now he lives in this gilded cage where he, in a sense, has no freedom. One of the great things about this is that that's admirable, especially in Twain's writing, is that the motif of persistence shines through in the narrative. Usually, when you get, especially in modern films and modern works, when tough circumstances happen, or when somebody's going to be unjustly persecuted, people kind of stand by and they don't do anything. And that mirrors the way that life is, especially now, right? People just stand there like NPCs, just watching something happen to someone, and no one seems to have any grit or character or virtue. Not no one, but you know what I mean. And these characters, maybe it's because they're young and they are untainted by the disappointments of adulthood or whatever, but they are persistent. They constantly try to do the right thing. And although Edward slips back into his monarch, and I don't mean MK Ultra monarch, I mean actual monarch, in his role as a monarch, both characters are seen as mad, right? They think they're crazy. So what happens is Tom is in the palace and he says, "I'm not really the prince. I'm a poor guy." And of course, he is the doppelganger. He's the double. He looks exactly like the prince, or they are the same person, but he looks exactly like the prince. And so all of the, his servants are like, no, this is insane. He's crazy. And they take him to Henry VIII. This was kind of cool. They take him to Henry VIII, his father. And Henry VIII in the book is kind of, he embodies and he does things that we know Henry VIII did, and sort of his popular, I don't know, his reputation for retribution and violence, because he has somebody decapitated. But at the same time, it's sort of counter to that, because there's a reason why Henry VIII ruled for the time that he did, and why he, established England the way that he did, and then he established it, which then Elizabeth took over, and then, they sort of became, they became the empire, right, under Elizabeth. And that's because he is likable. He is, he's popular and likable, even though he's at the end of his life. What happens is Tom is taken to him, and he says, I'm not really the prince. And Henry says, oh, dear boy, he's sick at heart. And he's so gentle, he takes him, he says, put your head on my chest. He like holds his heart. He loves him. He loves this boy, and he's willing to do anything for him. And then what happens is Henry dies. And of course, Edward, who is now the Tom character, he's the pauper, finds this out in like a dirty, disgusting, orgiastic revel in a hovel of a pub, where all these weird, gross characters are, and but even they hear that the king is dead. The king is dead. Long live the king! And he says, "I'm now the king." And then they think he's mad, because there's no way he would be. We know that Tom himself, when he was poor, has already set up this sort of lifestyle of this imaginary world. And what they do is they have a mock coronation ceremony, and they call him is it King Fufu? They crown him as like sort of king of the beggars. Later on, though, he'll stand up for himself, because he's the butt of jokes and then abuse by this other character, Hugo. But he ends up getting a cudgel and beating Hugo over the head, and then they actually fight. And of course, Edward, who is now the pauper, has been trained in the art of chivalric fighting, and it's described as gladiator fight. It reminded me of that scene in Family Guy, where it's gladiator mice. Remember, Peter has the mice fighting like guy. I have everything and you have nothing. Remember? Sorry, but they fight this sort of miniature battle, and he comes out on top, and then he wins respect. He wins the respect of them, but he still tries to run away, because he wants to get back to his life. And what's crazy also is that even though they're young, which is this is crazy that they would do this, but Edward forgets basically even really meeting Tom, and switching roles, and like changing clothes, and essentially handing it over. And he says in one part, like, oh, he describes him as a usurper. Now that's what I mean by the James Joyce, it's sort of the anti-Joycean Salinger vernacular, because there's no way that a kid would use the word usurp, right? But this is because it's a social satire, and it's meant for adults. Also, that he says this is a usurper, and then he finds himself in the company of this hermit. The hermit says, "Come on in," and you think that the hermit's going to be good, because he's this humble John the Baptist religious character, sort of living on locusts and honey. And he's out in the woods, but then he tells Edward that he is an archangel, and you're like, okay, where are we going with this? And immediately Edward says, oh no, now I'm in the hands of this crazy guy. And then what the guy does is he bounds his hands, and he takes out a knife, and he's about to, I guess, ritually sacrifice him. He's gonna kill this KID, and he's saved by his protector. And his protector, he does kind of have a guardian angel character in this, and his protector is Miles Hendon, not Henley, but Hendon. And Miles himself embodies the prince and the pauper roles, like within his own character, because he's a knight, and he's been on military campaigns, but he's lost his fortune. He's a gentleman without means, right? But he takes in Edward, and Edward immediately, because he's being beaten by his dad, and Miles is just walking around and sees this and stops the hand that's about to beat him. And there are a number of he adopts him. He tells John to get out of here, but John gets him back. His dad gets him back, and a number of times they go back and forth, but Miles sort of prevails. And then we find out Miles has lost his fortune and his land and his noble house or his manor because of false information, sort of satanic, accusing false information from his own family that's double crossed him. And then what happens at the end of the story is, just to skip to the end. I'm not skipping to the end, but I'm going to skip to the end for this part. Is that they are put in prison. They're about to be executed for thievery because Edward was set up by another character, and this lady presses charges on them, and then the judge has mercy, and he takes mercy on Edward, and he says to the woman, how much was the item worth that you stole? It ends up being a pig. It's a pig in a blanket. And she says oh, it was, I don't know, so many shillings. And the judge says, well, the death penalty is the penalty. You get the death penalty for stealing over however much the amount is. And so, are you sure you want to press charges? And the woman says, no, I don't want the kid to die. So she recants that and gives another statement about how much it costs, and it was less than that. So she saves him. But anyway, then later on, they're thrown in prison, and Miles takes the punishment for Edward. He actually gets beaten and whipped in his stead. And that's interesting because there's a famous scene. One of the scenes that I really remember from reading this in first grade is that there's a whipping boy. And I was like, that took me because you're young and you don't understand what that concept is. But basically it's like, you know what the whipping boy is. It's essentially they can't lay hands on the royal person. So instead they have to choose another boy who's going to take the punishment for him. And then when Tom, who now is the King of England, because he's about to be crowned right at the end of the story, but he is the king in waiting, right? The king to be, the king not elect, but he's not yet ascended to the throne. But when he's up there, he's talking to the whipping boy, and he says, "There's going to be no more whipping boys, and there's going to be no more violence." He essentially voids the Dane law and the law of blood, as he calls it. Now, there are a number of Christ-like motifs in this. One is that we have a character who is a high character, but he descends to live amongst the poor, right, and amongst the common people. And then at the end of the story, he ascends to his position, and then he's crowned king, right? And when he does that, he, of course, restores all of the loyalty and the nobility that people have offered him, and all of the people that are unrepentant get their punishment, right? He also, like I said, he gets rid of this sort of blood law. He pardons a number of people. There's a kid who has been sentenced to death because he caught I think he caught a hawk, and he didn't know that he was in the king's territory, of course. So they say he was a poacher. He's ignorant of it though, but he's going to be hanged. And of course, Edward pardons him. He says, "No, you got to let this kid go." He restores Miles to his original, not only to his original position, but he gives him a hereditary title, and then that lives on in the story in history because he retains this sort of informal privilege of sitting by the king, because when Miles adopts Edward, whom he thinks is actually just a pauper, he doesn't really know to believe his fantastical stories about being the king, but he humors him, and Edward says you can't sit while I'm sitting to eat dinner, and so he stands behind him and he kind of humors his imagination because he thinks this kid's traumatized. but then at the end of the story, when he's restored, he's given a hereditary title. He becomes, I think, the Earl of Kent. He is the only person allowed to sit in the king's presence. Mirror imagery plays a major role in the story as well, and also the loving cup. The loving cup is a motif in this. The loving cup is, you guys know what the loving cup is? It's essentially like where two men are going to share the drink of unification and the end of hostilities, and they both have to put their hands on the cup because, like, if you take your hand off, you grab your dagger, right? So it shows like they're both grabbing it, and they offer the loving cup in the mock coronation to Edward, but he uses the opportunity to, like, he takes his hand off and then he gets away, and he always, it's interesting that one of the images is he always crawls away like under the feet of the grown-ups. So he goes lower, right? He's like, he's about as humble as he can be. And one of the powerful scenes in this was that after Edward escapes from the psychotic hermit who's going to kill him, he ends up in a stable. He ends up in a barn, right? It's a sort of a Bethlehem image because he's this innocent child. He's in the stable, and he's essentially looking for a manger, right? And he has nobody and no one, and he realizes that he's about as low as he can go. And he thinks that he reaches out in the darkness, and he thinks somebody touches him, and he thinks it's like either a literal demon, like the demon hermit, or he thinks it's a ghost, or he thinks it's someone dead. And that wouldn't be unusual because he's seen so much death in his life. And so then he like reaches out in the darkness and he feels something. It feels like hair. And he thinks he's going to like trail his hand up and he's going to find a skull. But in one of the brilliant, like touching moments in this, he actually finds that it's the tail of a calf. And so he finds that it's this little calf that's sleeping beside him in the barn. And he like kind of just nuzzles up against the calf and they sleep, and they fall asleep. And he says, if he ever becomes king again, he'll make sure that nobody, that all the he says all the innocent children will be spared because bless the little children, right? The next day he goes outside and he sees some children, and the children are the only one that live on the farm, and they're the only ones that are nice to him. But he wakes up in the morning from the barn, and he's got a rat asleep on his chest. And he doesn't even this doesn't startle him at all, but the rat kind of gets startled and runs away. And he says, he has this uplifting moment where he says, I can only go up from here because this is about as base as one can get. He's asleep in a barn. He has no parents, no friends. Nobody loves him. Nobody cares for him. He's worried about the fact that he knows that his dad, Henry VIII, is dead and nobody seems to be looking for him. And that's when he remembers about Tom, but he says that children and him, they're like this rat in a way, because the rat the rat is a rat, but it's like this innocent little creature who wanted to just be warm and nuzzle up against him and the calf, and it never hurt him. So that's really brilliant. It's a really touching moment. And from there he goes on his sort of Arthurian hero's journey quest for redemption. He goes through some more trials and tribulations, but he ends up getting to Buckingham Palace, where he sees that they're about to crown Tom king. And what happens is great, because he sees Tom, and Tom just doesn't feel right in the situation in which he's found himself. And he sees them shooing away, you pace off, wine cat, to the actual Edward. And he says, lay your hands off of that boy. He's the real king. And then they say, no, he's not, and he says, no, there's proof. And they say, there's no proof. And all the adults talk, there's no proof. And he says, there is proof. There is one thing that's proof. And he challenges Edward to remember the thing that he left behind, that nobody can find, which is vital to the story and to proving their identity. And that is the king's seal. He has the king's seal. and he challenges him to remember what he did with it. And Edward remembers it, produces the seal, and then they say to Tom, he's the reason that Tom is not punished in the end. One of the reasons is that Edward says, "What did you do with the seal?" And he says, I didn't know what it was. I thought, and he had, Tom had, when he went to his first dinner, it was all this food and all this banquet that he never like ever even thought he could imagine. In fact, he some of the details are brilliant that Twain includes, because he includes the fact that like he sees turnips, and turnips are recently imported from Holland. They're like a delicacy. He'd never seen them before. And then he sees that there are nuts on the table. He grabs a handful of nuts and he puts them in his pocket. And then he immediately feels sorry for the fact that he's like taken them, right? Because he's a thief. But they make him be a thief. But then when he takes the nuts, he cries. He breaks down crying, and then he tells Edward at the end, "I used the seal. I thought it was a nutcracker." So he was, and everybody laughs, and like so that's the moment of redemption. And then he basically says that Tom will now be the king's ward, so he's taken care of for the rest of his life, and he lives to be an old man. Of course, Miles lives to be an old man, and his hereditary title lives on in perpetuity. And then, of course, the dramatic irony of this whole thing is the sadness about the real Edward VI, because Edward, who now ascends to the throne, was only alive till he was 15. He died young, and that was it. And of course, then we had, Bloody Mary. First of all, we had Lady Jane Grey. If you don't know anything about Lady Jane, that's pretty interesting. I included some pictures in the intro to the stream, because from this movie that I don't know, probably nobody's seen it. I've seen it because I saw it back when it came out. I think I saw it probably on HBO, at my grandmother's house or something. And it's called Lady Jane, and it's it's like the story of Lady Jane and what's his name? I guess Robert Dudley, is that who it is? Played by Cary Elwes, and this came out around the time of The Princess Bride. I think it was the same. It was in 1986. I think it was 1985. I think was the year it came out. And Helena Bonham Carter, a very young Helena Bonham Carter, plays Lady Jane. But it's about their courting of each other, and how then she was the 9 days queen, if you didn't know that. And she was then executed. I included the painting of that. She was scourged and beheaded by Bloody Mary. And then, of course, Bloody Mary was gone, and then Elizabeth took over. So interesting, it's an interesting history, especially, all of the turmoil that occurred with the death of Henry VIII, because of the, who was going to get the right of ascension. And then we have these inner wars between the royals. Of course, that always happens. I mean, look at World War I, right? When you had the Kaiser, the Tsar, and Albert, all grandsons of not Albert. Albert was the son of Victoria, but the three grandsons of Queen Victoria, all vying for what they were doing in World War I. And of course, this continues in our day with the grand chessboard and the wars of struggle between the various power elements of the power structure. So, Andrew says, just imagine when Elizabeth dies. Yeah, it's crazy, because we've discussed that in relation to Macbeth, because we remember we talked about, if you guys haven't seen this, go back to my Macbeth stream. It was my very first stream, and I keep going back to that because it continues to be relevant. But remember that Shakespeare wrote this sort of not under the patronage of King James, even though he was a member of the King's Men, so he was his patron. But it is interesting that Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Virginia, right, dies without an heir, and not just a male heir, but any heir, right? Virgin Queen because she was married to the nation of Britain, and so they have to find somebody to take the throne, and that was King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England, uniting the English and the Scottish thrones and kickstarting the Jacobean era, and then that gave rise to of course, the authorized version, the AV, the King James Bible, in 1611. Then we have the death of Shakespeare in 1616. But it is interesting because there's always some sort of crisis, right? I mean, just look at the actual historical period of the Restoration, right? With Charles II. Look at the Glorious Revolution with William III. They get, you know, William III, William of Orange is Dutch, right? And Mary's Queen Mary. It sort of continuously happens. It's always a crisis, but I think it's particularly so in this great transition period in the 1500s because this is when England was really transitioning from the Middle English period to the Modern English period, and from the sort of medieval Anglo-Saxon world into the Renaissance, and then further on into the sort of the modern empire. So, so what happens at the end? Of course, yes, Edward is crowned king, and he grants his various things that we discussed, and the novel ends in a true climax, and that is part of what makes it a children's story. The happy ending. It also appeals to kids, especially in the late 19th century. Twain died in 1910, but the elements to consider are that it is a biting social critique of the discrepancy between the lower classes and the upper classes. That's obvious in the story. And did you hear that thunder? Whoa, that was crazy, you guys. Thunder outside. So, but what's also interesting is that hasn't changed. Well, it may have changed for a while, but it certainly is back and worse than it ever was. And that is under a democratic system, right? which was the aim of Twain's social critique. So that will, I know it's a short stream, that will conclude our Prince and the Pauper analysis. Not too short. I mean, I think we did a good analysis of the story. And if you want to, don't forget, if you want to super chat, if you want to support me, you can still do that. You can do that at any time through PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo. Ask me a question. Let me give a shout out to somebody. Let's see. And of course, coming up, we've got a bunch of stuff this week. I'm going to continue my music analysis stream. I'll probably do a stream analyzing some Rage Against the Machine lyrics. I just was thinking of that earlier. I thought about it a couple weeks ago. But especially Know Your Enemy, I think it would be interesting to look at that and to look at, of course, Rage Against the Machine is the machine now, as Kristen, Slowboy Whiteboard, shouts out to our homegirl, has said. But we can go back to the text, so to speak, or the music lyrics and look at that. And of course, again, just to remind you, I'll be doing the Hollywood Scumbag stream. Do you like that title? Because that's what it is, really. And we'll be looking at Crimson Tide, right, with Denzel and Gene Hackman. And in that interview with Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, they talk about, Charlie Rose goes, so did you consider getting Tom Cruise? Was he up for the role? And they're like, and Don Simpson's like, no. And then, I mean, yes, but not really. And you can tell the real answer is no, he's not right for the role. He doesn't fit this movie. We wanted Gene Hackman. And they're like, well, why didn't you get him? And he's like, well, he was busy. He was busy at the time. And so they got Gene Hackman. But he says Gene Hackman is kind of he's a serious actor. And he holds a certain gravitas, but he's perfect for that role, right? It's one of the brilliant things about these guys is their casting. I mean, I know they're not the casting directors, but they have final say. They're the producers. And we'll maybe be looking at Days of Thunder. You got to go around the track slow. You're not one of these. See, you cold trickle. You one of these fast city boys. You want to go around the track all fast. But see, what you got to do is go around the track slow. Like my cousin, when he first got them Velcro shoes, he would just take the Velcro. He'd do it one little Velcro tooth at a time. That's what you got to do. You got to go around the track slow, says Robert Duvall. So we'll be looking at that. And of course, the book High Concept by Don Simpson. And then Basic Instinct, which is an interesting, neo-noir, but neon and sun-soaked early 90s LA, detective story with the kind of oversexed, hard-boiled, fake and gray actor Michael Douglas, right? And And of course, that's what, sort of broke, Sharon Stone broke with that role. And of course, it's got Gene Triplehorn. Speaking of Tom Coombs, it's got Gene Triplehorn in an underrated role in Basic Instinct. Yeah, Thays of Dunder, says Thomas Henderson. And then, of course, either before or after that, I'm going to be looking at the book American Sniper by Chris Kyle, and we'll be discussing what he says in the novel, especially about Governor Jesse Ventura from Minnesota. I heard you're going to be analyzing Chris Kyle. I want to talk about Chris Kyle. So we'll be discussing that. And we're going to roll strong here into September and into the fall. And then Spooktober, we'll have our own thing. Of course, again, Spooktober, trademark to JD, obviously. But we will be doing our own sort of side streams for Spooktober and doing some spooky literature. So that's about all I got. I hope you guys have a wonderful night, an awesome Sunday tomorrow. Thank you for joining me here. I love y'all. And thanks again. Special shout out to our homeboy Jack out there who sponsored this stream on Twain and the Prince and the Pauper. Shouts out to you, homeboy. Love you. Thank you so much for supporting me. And again, if you want to sponsor a stream, don't forget you can email me at madmaximalism@gmail.com. Maximalism with 2 X's. Madmaximalism, 2 X's. You can email me anytime, especially with ideas for streams. You can leave them in the comments below. Please make sure you like and share the stream and continue to help me get those subs up. We're trying to get to 1,000 subs. And that's about all I got, y'all. I love y'all. Peace.